Is that a bump to the head?
No, it could be, but I think we need to get you to a neurologist. Nothing urgent.
A neurologist?
Yes, a brain expert.
I know what a neurologist is.
Fine, I just thought the way you asked.
Well, I thought maybe you said urologist. Why would I need to see a neurologist?
For a look-see, the eyes are part of the brain after all.
That's not true, is it?
Why would I say something if it wasn't true?
It just doesn't seem right.
Like morally correct or as right as inaccurate?
I'm not sure. Accurate, I guess.
Interesting. I can't argue with further testing.
Okay, you're a doctor, right? Am I dying? Can you tell me that?
No.
No, you can't tell me.
I can't tell you.
You can't tell me if you can't tell me.
No.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. Today's topic is romantic relationships in the workplace.
Okay, Cameron, we are now, we're completely discombobulated today because we are actually doing this podcast face to face.
In the flesh.
Yes, and it's completely thrown us off completely.
Yeah.
So where do you think, do you have any idea where that script came from?
I have no idea whatsoever. So I'm not going to try and speculate. I'm waiting for you to tell me.
All right. Have you seen the film Being John Malkovich?
No, I've never seen it.
You've never seen that?
It's a terribly famous film.
It is.
And I haven't seen it.
How about Adaptation?
I don't think I've seen that
Nicolas
either.
Cage. Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
I thought you'd definitely be like a Being John Malkovich person.
Yeah,
Have seen that?
I do like John Malkovich, the actor.
Yeah.
So.
Well, the script is actually taken from selections from the entire script, so it's not actually doesn't flow like that in the actual film. It's from a film called Syndicate, New York. You wouldn't have seen that if you haven't seen John Malkovich.
I'm getting so uncultured now. I just haven't seen any of these movies.
Well, the writer is a guy called Charlie Kaufman.
Okay.
He's a very out there sort of thinker, and that particular film it's very unusual. It's really worth a watch. I'd recommend seeing some of his earlier stuff first, just to get a flavour of what he does. I'll tell you what film you might have seen. Eternal Sunshine on the Spotless Mind with Jim Carrey.
I have seen that.
You've seen that?
Actually,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So he did that as well.
Okay.
Which actually I didn't like that much, strangely, but I like the other ones quite a bit.
Well, I want to go see the other ones now.
Yeah, Being John Malkovich is pretty good. I think if you watch that, you'll be like, it's one of those films that just keeps expanding out, and it gets very, very strange. But it is a very, very good film. But this one is called, Syndicate, New York. And the reason it popped into my mind is something we'll discuss later. I'm actually reading a novel by Charlie Kaufman, which I discovered on the weekend, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay,
so we're going to save that for later.
We'll save that for later. Yeah. I can't promise that it's going to be something, if people listen all the way through the podcast, they'll get to the end and go, oh, wow, I can't believe it. It's fantastic. I'm glad I got to hear Nick's review of this book. And I won't be able to say too much about the book because it would give it all away.
Oh.
So it's actually not worth listening to this podcast today right to the end, just so you know. So today we're looking for a topic that we thought might be of interest, and probably coincidentally, we had there's a lot of stuff happening in the media at the moment about sexual harassment and even worse, I guess also sexual assaults.
Yes.
And it's essentially occupying the media at the moment in Australia. And what we thought would be interesting is a topic about relationships in the workplace, in particular romantic relationships in the workplace. And then sometimes I guess you could argue that they're good, they're positive to people having a nice relationship. A lot of people meet their partners that way.
Yeah.
In other situations, the romance could be one-sided.
Yeah.
And other times it's not necessarily romance; it's obsession, and it's and other times it can be just subtle forms of obsession, which can fall into harassment, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It just occurred to me, I owe my existence to relationships in the workplace with my parents met.
Oh, really?
in the workplace. Yeah.
My parents did as well.
Yeah, there you go.
Interesting. Yeah.
Good. There is that side of it.
What workplace did your parents meet in?
I think my dad was they were both working at a company called something like that, but I mean, it was a really long time ago.
That sounds like
my mother was in the typing pool or something like that, and my dad was in an office, and they met each other, and obviously the rest is history, as they say.
Instatech sounds like a company you get in a Marvel movie. It sounds like a place where they make Spider-Man or something.
Yeah. And I met my partner in his workplace, but I'm not sure whether that counts.
What was his workplace?
A bar.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. That's good. Well, very good. I'm trying to think. Did I meet Christine in her workplace? No, I didn't.
Yeah.
So the tradition's already been broken.
Good. I've done something.
Although it's probably getting harder now in some ways to meet people in the workplace. There's a little bit more, perhaps more rules and more, and a little bit more attention paid to protocol in the workplace.
We could do a whole other thing on Zoom relationships, I suppose.
Zoom relationships, is there such a thing? Yes, there is.
Well, there's internet dating, app dating, all that, and that's
long distance relationships on the telephone. That was a thing for a long time. So is Zoom the new version of that? I think people are more likely to be.
I think it's interesting though. I think internet dating is way more normalized now. Like I think 10 years ago, if people met their partner like on, well, it wasn't apps so much then, but through that way, they kind of make up the story they didn't want to tell people. Now they're just like, yeah, we met on Tinder. I don't think it's such a big deal anymore. Yeah,
it's interesting because I look at all these new dating apps and I think, oh God, that looks so much easier than what you had to do before.
You're a married man.
I'm on there every night, of course. Yes.
You're one of your old
Well, I was very interested in this whole Tinder thing as a concept for
swiping.
Yeah, the swipe.
Yeah, and they're also disposable. It's weird.
Yeah, and I thought this is fantastic. I mean, imagine that you could sit there and like find the ideal person.
Yeah.
Every single person I've spoken to is single and who uses it say it's a complete nightmare, and it's destroyed dating, and they never find anyone they like on those things. Yeah,
it's interesting. I'm glad I'm not out there anymore.
I think also there's a sense of rejection as well if you're not showing up on people's lists or they're not returning. Like it's not just that you'll find this dream person, but you could actually be rejected by all these virtual people over and over again. And so it must be demoralizing as well.
Absolutely.
Because there's probably more people to reject you than there are to go out with if you think about it statistically.
I'm sure I would have found it really hard if I was 18 now or something and I wanted to go out and date and that was how I was doing it. I'm sure I'd find that rejection. Like, not that 18-year-old me would reject very often.
Well, we're going to bring in our next guest, and her name is Dr. Lisa Interligi. Lisa is, like myself, she's a Doctor of Organisational Psychology. So basically that means if you're on an aeroplane and somebody has a heart attack, we're actually not very useful in that capacity.
Yeah.
We might be all right at organising or looking at the culture of the aviation industry or something, but we certainly aren't going to be very useful in saving someone's life directly, but we do it indirectly sometimes, perhaps, maybe. So Lisa, I've known for a number of years. She is she's worked at executive levels. She's a specialist in culture, amongst many other things. She's just started, she actually hasn't just started. She's actually had a business for a number of years called Launching Pad, which you're now in the full swing of, transforming it and building on it. So you might want to talk a bit about that today, but Lisa's going to talk to us today about relationships in the workplace. So let's bring Lisa in.
Wow, I don't even know whether I can compete with that. That's crazy, guys.
Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks very much.
Yes, you're our first in-person guest, so we're very excited.
Very excited and very timely, I guess, subject.
Yeah, and Lisa, we first met back at Monash in what year would that be, do you think? Would have been,
I don't know.
Would have been 2008, 2006, around that time. Yeah. So Lisa and I have crossed paths a few times. We've worked in construction together. We spent many a time in after hours classes back in our postgraduate degrees, sort of chuckling and having a bit of a laughing fit over some of the crazy stuff that we would be learning about and the conversations that were going on. And behind closed doors, we also have a bit of a chuckle at the crazy antics that happen in the workplace as well.
Yeah.
Workplaces are a bit like a zoo, and you've got to have a bit of fun while you're there. Now you would have seen probably more than I would have seen operating at sort of those executive levels. You're working with lots of, executives and maybe other organisations, counterparts of other organisations. Have you ever had? Is there any interesting story or anything you've observed, or any interesting peculiarities about people who are operating sort of at the top of those organisations?
Change the names if you have to.
Yeah, I guess that they get to that level in an organisation usually because they're quite ambitious. Sometimes they are very confident and maybe sometimes a little bit narcissistic. So, you're always dealing with people who are not easy personalities. They're not usually easygoing people, and they usually are motivated by their, things that interest them. And so understanding how to relate to those people and find what their drivers are and to try and influence them, particularly around the people and culture stuff and transformation work that I do, is always challenging. But as long as you've got a smile on your face, it's usually okay.
Would it be true? Is a requirement to get to a much more senior position to work like just extreme hours? Is that true, or is it like doesn't really make that much of a difference? There's plenty of people like managing directors, executives who perhaps actually very balanced lifestyle, and it's something else there.
I think that's probably true in the past, Nick. I think that a lot of people have worked excessive hours because it's a badge of honour. Whether they're actually very productive or not, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
But I think now, particularly with COVID and maybe with people, worrying more about work-life balance and also with a lot more women in the workplace, those old behaviours are being challenged a little bit. Not saying that they've been completely smashed, but that people are. We have leaders who are interested in dropping their kids off, picking their kids up, and having a more balanced existence in their life. But we've still got a ways to go.
And it varies from workplace to workplace, right? So I've been working across a few different organisations in the last year or so, and I've noticed huge differences in team dynamics. And one place I'm working with now, if you have to go drop off your kids or pick them up, that's really, really cool, and everyone's very supportive of that. And another place I know from the past was just like that would have been an issue for people, I think. So cultures definitely vary.
And I think it's different for males and females. We used to work in construction. Is one of the things we have in common, Nick and I, and also in the mining industry. Where if a woman had to go and pick up their kids from after school care or from school, she talked about the walk of shame that people would be judging her as she walked out because she was maybe early, even if she was going to log on, later and really late into the night, and nobody saw that. So, there's a lot of judgmental stuff that happens in the workplace, and it should be more about performance rather than presenteeism.
Yeah, I find that interesting because I know before we came on, we were talking about parliamentary culture. I mentioned one of the things is like the really long hours, and in sort of the latter part of when I was there, I sort of came to realise and not be scared to sort of discuss that productivity is a different thing. So being in the building 15 hours a day doesn't necessarily mean you're producing really quality stuff in that time. Like you might.
If anything, I think those sorts of hours would actually lead to you not performing at high quality.
Yeah. So
you could either be overworking something to the point that it's actually you've ruined it, or you're killing yourself so much that you're just not performing at all. Like we've all tried to sit down and like draft something technical at the end of the day when your mental capacity's dropped, and you notice the immediate sort of deficit in your performance.
Yeah.
And then you can wake up in the morning with fresh eyes, and all of a sudden you can sit there and oh wow, I can juggle that 3 or 4 different things.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And also, you can't stay at a really high. You can't stay at 50 the entire time.
No, it's not really human, is it? And it also depends on the industry. I think you were saying before, Cameron, about working in government. I think the same could be said about construction and mining. There's a culture of working really long hours, and if you don't, you kind of
It's expected.
less of a person. And whereas in local government, for example,
Different.
that's probably a little bit different.
Now we wanted to have a chat to you today about I guess relationships in the workplace, romantic relationships. One of the things I might find interesting, you may not be able to talk about this in any great detail, is given your position, have you ever had to manage issues where people have had declared or reported, where they've been harassed or something's happened? It may not even be like sexual harassment; it could just be bullying or some other issue that.
I know, like many times. And sometimes, they come to me for investigation, and sometimes they come to me for a decision about, what has to happen as a result of an investigation. It's complex, just having lots of people, particularly when you're working in, large organisations, having lots of people work long hours sometimes is, different issues arise. Some of them.
How many? Yes. It may not be a difference, but is it often intentional or unintentional, or is it a bit of a mix? Like I can imagine situations where somebody feels as though they're being harassed or something, they're being bullied even, and the other person is thinking, "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." Whereas there might be other situations where it actually is quite deliberate, like the person's really trying to get at someone and they know exactly what they're doing. Or is it might be difficult to unpack?
No, I think that some people may dislike somebody for whatever reason. It can be intentional, but often it's unintentional. At least, people haven't got that sort of self-insight or emotional intelligence to understand that their behaviour is impacting somebody in a certain way. And it can be quite devastating for both parties. And you need to, I guess, treat both parties with great sensitivity.
So obviously, like power dynamics can come into play there, because it might be, between two people who is a hierarchical thing. The simplest one would be someone, the boss, and the person who works for that person. And so that obviously complicates matters. Like it can make the person subject to unwanted sort of attention that might make them feel uncomfortable, sort of expressing their discomfort.
I mean, I think that's the crux of the issue, isn't it? Really, workplace relationships is the power dynamic.
Yeah.
And, whether it's, it's just something that I would advise any executive or anybody in management, managing a team, not to have any sort of personal relationship with people that work in their line. It's just not. It's not a thing that you should put yourself at risk that way.
So how would you? That's interesting. Like, so how would they approach that then? Like, if there were two people and they were, very interested in each other and wanted to explore having a relationship, what do they do? Like, do they, not date while they're in the workplace? Does one of them have to leave? Do they not pursue the relationship? Like, human nature being what it is. Like, I'm talking about consensual. Relationships.
But even consensual stuff can go off the rails really easily.
Sure.
Often you see when people, they have a romantic bust up, it can flow into the workplace, and that can lead to a whole lot of unintended consequences or intended consequences. But I think that it would be better, particularly for a senior person. I think once you get into senior leadership positions, if you do have somebody that you have a consensual relationship with, then somebody has to move out of that line.
And is, like, with these, assuming there is such a relationship in the workplace, when I worked in Parliament, actually relationships have to be declared. So if you're working, I'm not sure if it's in a non-government setting. I was in opposition originally, but what I'm getting at is ministerial advisors will have security clearances. And part of having a security clearance is actually any romantic relationship you have has to be declared. And without going into details too much, with one of the not the current crop of sexual harassment allegations in the workplace at the moment, but out of the Four Corners, I think last year, was talking about an advisor's relationship with a minister, and I immediately wondered whether she declared the relationship because she had a security clearance, but she would have been declaring a relationship with her own boss. And every office has a contact, a security officer, who you have to sort of, if you go on holiday somewhere, you have to get clearance to go on holiday to a particular country. So this is just one little detail that fits into all these layers, but so declaring relationships, and then people meet each other in the workplace. It's I don't know. It's a grey area there. I think is what
it is. It's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to navigate. I think it's particularly hard to navigate given all of these issues at the moment that are being raised. Post Me Too.
Yeah.
You get Australian government. You get one person saying something, and then you get a floodgate of people making complaints. As same as the Me Too movement. It is difficult, but I think you need to err on the side of caution, particularly if you're in a leadership role. You can't. We've seen so many people lose their positions because of this issue. And I think it's just not worth the risk.
I think it's good advice to say exactly that. It's like you're in this position. It's just be extremely careful with this because it's not worth your career. It's not worth your job. There's plenty of people out there.
Yeah.
Don't put yourself in that position.
Yeah.
Where it probably gets really tricky is let's say that two people liked each other, and then you decide, look, we're going to do the right thing. One of us is going to have to leave. It'd be very hard, wouldn't it, if the person underneath decides they're going to leave?
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, because you feel pressured, of course, if you weren't the person who was more senior to do it. Why can't that person do it?
No, and it's a strange way to start a relationship.
It is.
Like I agree with what you're saying, like in principle and in practice to some extent. But I think there's some grey there. I think I told you before we started, like I had a kind of a rule. I didn't date in my workplace, particularly when I was at Parliament. But the real motivator for that was I didn't want to talk about work after work. Like I didn't sort of want to be with somebody who was in that world because I just would have had no opportunity to leave it. And the person I ended up like settling down with is completely to all that. So maybe like different people need different things. And I'm actually interested in the kind of what people consider to be their ideal mate in a professional sense. Because like when I was in academia, I noticed a lot of academics settle down with other academics. Like that seems to be almost expected. I'm kind of interested when an academic settles down, with a trainee or somebody like completely different to their own background.
I'm interested in. There was one that came out the other day. I thought it was. When you listen to the story, you kind of go, nothing serious happens, but it was still one of those kind of creepy sort of things that happen in the workplace that you can kind of understand. You can understand why a person would feel uncomfortable. It was, I don't know if you followed de Blasio issue there. You follow that? It was, he said, I think there was someone working in his office, and he would come up to her and say things like, would you ever be interested in dating an older man? And so the implication there was he was sort of, I guess, sussing out whether or not she'd be interested in going out with him. Yeah. And she felt extremely uncomfortable with the whole thing. And you kind of, if you have the empathy and you put yourself in someone's shoes, in certain situations, you can. It's not necessarily that the person's actually done anything like physically or put pressure on them, but there's implications. There's like the subtext. And it must be very difficult for people to report that, when they feel as though they're under pressure. Is that
something harassment?
Yeah, well, this is what I was.
I think that's sexual harassment.
I know women, young women, like this is maybe going back a little bit when I was younger, and they've told me things, and they've said, but it's not harassment. Like or is it because they didn't feel it was serious enough, and they felt uncomfortable in. I'm not going to go into details about that one woman who left a workplace because she was made to feel uncomfortable by a senior person at workplace. And it'll be like little things like phone calls and insinuations, maybe light touching, but just, it is harassment though. But maybe that one of the problems is people don't realise that and communicate what harassment is.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, right? Because there's been a shift in society's expectations around this issue, and particularly following that Me Too movement, is that women are more likely to express when they feel uncomfortable with something, which if that is unspoken previously, then it's usually women in that Me Too movement, but it could be men as well.
Yeah.
It's unless people are aware of what the boundaries are.
Yeah.
Then it's hard for them to know what to do.
How generational do you think this kind of stuff is? There's a generational component to it, but it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, no, I think there is a generational component. But if the culture has shifted and community's expectations have shifted, then unless people have been told they've shifted, it's like being on that tipping point, right? It's about, today it's okay, tomorrow it's not okay.
Yeah.
And what has changed between today and tomorrow, and how do I need to adapt to that?
Yeah.
And unless, particular companies are helping train their people, give them codes of conduct, being specific around policies, doing all that infrastructure boring stuff. It is hard for people just to, discern where that tipping point's happened and that all of a sudden they're on the wrong side.
Yeah. Yeah. And even I don't want to generalize, but with maybe an older generation of men, even though they're having a female boss is an unusual thing. I think just from my experience with them, I've worked with guys who have never had the experience of having a woman as a boss before, and it's something they're in their 50s or something like that. It's something they do, and I don't know, they seem to have a problem with it. But my generation completely different because I've always had bosses who were men and women, and so I think that's naturally sorting itself out.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think, again, it depends on, the industry. If you're coming out of a male-dominated industry where it's unlikely that you've had females in leadership positions, then, that's going to be a little bit harder for, men so to have that experience that maybe in workplaces that you've been in. It's going to be more progressive.
It's interesting in government sector, specifically in defence, for the civilian side of defence and also the military side, there's a much stronger emphasis on women coming through, but they've had to be pretty overt about that and push it. So I think for a long time they thought it would just sort itself out. But you have to actively find talent and push them through.
Yeah, it's interesting. So basically, also it's like this, what you're referring to as a sort of ever-evolving thing as well. So it's kind of like what you're suggesting is there has to be the right systems in place to constantly be in touch with what's happening. So, society standards, that kind of thing.
And the law.
And executing it into day-to-day, practice.
Yeah, that's right. I think you need to reflect the law and as well as expectations, which is a little bit more grey than what the law is.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So we talked a little bit about the grey areas, and also we spoke about how a lot of it's unintentional. And I liked what you brought up before, which is kind of initially, and it's actually a really good point that often isn't brought up. You're saying that sometimes you're sitting two people down, and it's actually almost catastrophic to the relationship. So what happens then usually? What kind of process would you normally go through with something like that if there was a situation like it could be bullying, for example? Is it trying to find some sort of path forward so they can work together again? And in your experience, is it easy for people to actually do that? Do you find that people almost need to find other areas to work in and be separated?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the severity of the bullying as to what happens and whether those two people can actually work together again. Sometimes it's not possible, and sometimes you need to arrange for them to be working in different areas and separate them physically. Sometimes it leads to somebody leaving the organisation intentionally. If you can, it would be great. But it does require people to, overcome all this emotion, and that's sometimes difficult. So it's not part of the rational process. And sometimes you bring in a mediator, and you can try and find ways of people modifying their behaviour. But often it leads to somebody resigning.
Yeah, when I was in one of my previous jobs, there was a situation where my manager was having to deal with was a manager, I should say, was having to deal with a person who was underperforming, and that particular person, I think, had a couple of bullying claims against them. And then when they found out that the manager was trying to basically process and put some material against them, they then took out a bullying claim against the manager and had to investigate that as well. And I could see how quite quickly all of these things can get really messy. Like if people are not, if it is intentional or they're not really there to play ball, so to speak. They're trying to work with the system.
That's a red herring, right? That often happens in performance management. You know, when somebody's not performing, you know, if you don't have experience in giving them structured feedback, if there's not clear agreed goals, and you're not good at doing performance management, it can quickly become a bullying claim. And you know, that's a bit problematic. And you're right, you do need to go through a process.
Yeah, you have to track down every claim as it comes through.
I was just wondering, given what you've said about, you know, how romantic relationships in the workplace are going to cause all kinds of conflicts, like, do you, if they sort of mature and people, you know, stay together as a couple in a workplace, have you had much experience with like family businesses? Like, I'm not so much talking about like, you know, shops and things like that, but sort of, you know, I can think of companies where there's like husband and wife teams, like, you know, co-CEOing or like, you know, on board together, and even, you know, maybe people's children and stuff. I mean, like,
business.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I mean, so how does that fit into it?
Yeah. Look, I don't have any personal experience. I've worked for large organisations where that hasn't necessarily been the case. But it's not just the actual conflict, it's perceived conflict.
Yeah.
It's whether people perceive there's a conflict.
Yeah.
And that's the critical thing.
But there are large organisations where that happens. I mean, think of like News Corp or something like that. Like, you know, the Murdochs essentially.
Yeah,
like,
no, I haven't. I haven't worked for them, and I haven't worked for Packers either.
Sure, yeah.
But you know, you could see how that perceived conflict.
That I think this is a good point too. So like that like actual conflict and perceived conflict. So that's, yeah, I find that interesting.
Am I getting preferential treatment because I happen to be the son or daughter?
Yeah.
And how do people feel about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I often think that you could also fall into the other trap, which is, let's say you've got your son's working for you or something, you go out of your way to not look after them, so it didn't look like you're giving them preferential treatment, you know, and then they're sitting there going, no, how come I'm getting all the dodgy jobs?
Well, that's what happened to Kerry Passer. You believe before his father sent him to like do the very worst jobs in the company.
Yeah.
Is that right? To like, you know, actually that's when they were still, you know, owning newspapers and stuff. Had to work on the printing press floor, and he got treated really badly by everyone.
But you need to have, you just need to have a transparent process for dealing with conflicts, right? It's like any other conflict. It's whether your mates or, you know, any other scenario that you have a transparent process and you don't get involved in things that could be perceived as a conflict of interest.
So people recuse themselves potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because then it removes the relationships like father and son or whatever it might be, and you just look at just general relationships. There's always going to be like all these different people. Some people you like better than others, and so on. So I suppose you've got to be really careful about like how you treat people. Like, and it must be really difficult because like even subconsciously,
you might be unconscious bias.
Correct. You don't even know what's happening. So and there could be people who like you think about in workplaces like they're not approachable, so you don't give them as much work because you can't stand having to go and talk to them. And that's really a bad thing to do because then it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like people don't go and speak to them and so on. And
that's the issue with diversity, right? Is that, you know, you tend to gravitate towards people who are more like you, and the people that are less like you don't, and therefore, you know, that's why diversity is always a challenge because you know, people are less likely to be like you, give you different opinions, might look different to you, might have different values than you, and actually it's a real problem.
And it can be a black spot because you might have like it could even just be somebody who is like potentially just has a completely different worldview to you, like the way that they think.
Yeah.
And you think you don't want to talk to them because you're going to have to get into a debate with them about something, or they're going to disagree with you. And so that's, I guess, the classic sort of yes man situation where you surround yourself with the yes man and then they end up.
That happens. I mean, I guess all sectors will happen in politics, obviously. The people are, and it's often better for your career prospects if you keep your mouth shut and don't be devil's advocate. I'm not talking about turning a blind eye to, you know, bad things happening or anything like that, but just like don't give advice that goes against what the prevailing groupthink is, but that's not your job at the end of the day. You're supposed to give the professional advice and be able to sort of speak truth to power. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the best influences are probably people who give the advice, but can do it in a way that they deliver it in a manner that doesn't aggravate the person who's receiving it. So I guess that's it's the way you go about doing it.
Yeah.
And so you're spending that time and also picking your battles as well.
It depends on the other person. Like some people get really easily aggravated, so you might be delivering it beautifully.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, if they're going to be unreasonable and get aggravated, then,
I was reading about something. I don't even know if it's related to this case in the media at the moment, but around just the risk of giving people the bad news and how you just don't deliver bad news to people because the way they react is just so unprofessional. And they shoot the messenger, and so essentially they never get the bad news, and then everything basically collapses in on itself. So, so I'm thinking about probably plenty of ministers and prime ministers, maybe the
senior ministers tend not to deliver bad news. So like they'll find other people to deliver bad news. So in the defence space, if there's bad news, that will usually be carved off to an assistant minister or someone else, or it'll be put out by the department at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon in a release or something like that. But ministers are all about good news. I'm sure it's the same with senior executives. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. Although I think probably less so.
Yeah. Less fundraising.
Yeah. Because you need to hear it, don't you? Isn't it funny as well? Because it's almost like the most important news you can get is actually bad news or something that's going wrong. It's like you absolutely need to know it, and it's like
there's an urgency.
Well, imagine if the doctor said to you, like, they didn't want to give you the bad news that you had cancer, and so they just sort of
it's bad news.
They sort of just said, "Oh, let's
it's bad news by me."
But more in a business sense, you wouldn't call it bad news.
No.
So there's either a risk to the business.
Yeah.
Or there's an impact to the business.
Yeah.
And really, they're things you really need to know so that you can manage them.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a bit different to, positioning it as bad news is kind of like that's the end point.
Yeah, that's true. Like, there's very little bad news in a sense, or like they'll try and spin almost everything. Like, there's, sometimes there is out and out bad news they can't really resile from it. Like, I remember fairly recently that whole robo-debt thing the government got themselves caught up in. At the end of the day, there was a court ruling there. The government was found to not be doing the right thing in that circumstance, have to make amends. That's bad news. So there's not too many ways you can spin that. But
you don't want to be as an executive in my role. I would never have anybody in my team who didn't come to me and say, we've got an issue or we've got a risk and we need to deal with it, because then you're just flying blind and that sets you up for a much bigger failure.
So that's interesting. We draw that back to the situation in Parliament at the moment. One of the things that's come out of that is plausible deniability, if you want to call it that, like who knew what. And it looks fairly clear that the Prime Minister was kept in the dark about the Britain Higgins case, like even by his own defence minister, possibly even by people in his own office. So if you're a senior executive and heading up any organisation, there's things going on in your organisation and people aren't telling you what's happening, surely that's a problem.
It is still a problem for you because you don't know is the problem.
Yeah. And why don't you know?
Yeah, why don't you know? What sort of organisation? There's a lot of
not having access to data, really.
Well, there's a lot of law now that talks about leadership being responsible for the culture of the company.
Yeah.
And so having a culture in an organisation where people are too frightened to come up and tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
Says something.
I think there's often, like, you might remember there's an episode of the Prime Minister, I think, where Humphrey Appleby tells the Minister or Prime Minister, "I'll tell you what you need to know," and that there is some of that in politics. Perhaps as a sense of protecting the boss. I'm not sure in this particular instance, who was motivated by what there, but if somebody isn't officially told something,
we saw how that played out with Dan Andrews and the hotel quarantine.
Yeah.
This I didn't know. They knew who made the decision. It wasn't me. It was them. That just undermines trust.
Yeah.
For the community, and I think it's something that's going to happen.
I agree. Yeah, and people in that world, people sometimes even claim they don't know. If it hasn't been sort of formally written down or minuted or communicated, they'll say, well, I as the minister of whatever, or the prime minister or the premier, I haven't been officially informed. Like if it's been scuttled up by the water cooler and I happen to have knowledge of it, that's not quite the same thing. And that's ridiculous. That doesn't.
No, but then that puts an obligation on you to dig deeper.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
try and find out.
Yeah, but I think it's one of the reasons the general public is so cynical about politics these days. Yeah.
Well, these days they've always been a bit cynical.
That's
right?
very true. They have always been. I don't think it was a golden age.
No. I think that is a really good point though, because it's like in many ways how that whole thing was handled, the quarantine thing, was worse than what actually happened in a way.
It's always, isn't it? It's always how it's handled.
It's the Watergate thing. So, the example of Watergate, like the initial break in the Watergate hotel was like wrong and serious, but the cover up and the way it was handled so much worse, and that's what ended up getting Nixon out.
Yeah, because obviously I'm of the view, like people are forgiving of mistakes if people own up to them and they just say, look, this is why I made the mistake. This is what happened. But I don't think they like the idea of people going behind closed doors and trying to avoid responsibility. I think that instinctively they kind of like they get very frustrated.
A lot of this goes back to media management, better or worse, probably worse. Like you'll notice with these things that they often play it out over 2-3 days, sort of hoping that the media cycle's going to move on to the next story. So their initial response to it will be small and non-existent. I'll wait for it to blow over, and then if it's clear to them it's not going to move on, then you'll see more serious responses. It's quite reactive rather than proactive.
Now, Lisa, you want to tell us a little bit about Launchingpad and some of the areas that you work in now? Like, what is you obviously got a background that covers lots of different topics, but what would the kind of the two areas of specialty you reckon that you would offer?
Sure. So first thing is I do big transformation work. That's how to do pragmatic change in organisations at large scale. So that's one. And the other one probably is looking at culture, as we've been talking about, and particularly advising executives and boards on how to shift and shape culture and how to be in control of culture a little bit better. And there's a lot of obligation on behalf of directors and officers under law here in Australia, but also just making sure that you're on the right side of that tipping point and that you're not going to end up, your reputation's going to be completely destroyed by not managing.
Yeah.
So when you're, culture, the discussion about culture probably, let's say 20, 30 years ago, it was a fairly new thing to talk about in organisations. Is it a lot easier now, do you reckon, talking to senior leaders about culture and they get it, or do you have to kind of still explain exactly what it is? Because it's still in many ways, a very abstract thing for people to get their heads around.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think everybody's got kind of what I say, mental model or a common understanding. But how that actually translates into changing culture is where the gap is.
Yeah, so I often notice that because you could argue, and I think one of our good colleagues, Simon Moss, who's been on this program, we're talking about culture, and he was saying, "Oh, well, everything is culture," and as in it, but he means it everything that we do is part of it. But I notice in workplaces now that there tends to be a very quick go-to for culture, as in whenever something is not working, even if it's a very tangible problem, people kind of sometimes use it for code for there's problems with behaviours or something the culture's wrong, and it becomes a bit of a scapegoat. And sometimes people throw it up almost a bit of a smokescreen to say, well, we've had all these problems but we can't do much about it because it's just the culture. It's the culture of the industry or something like that. Do you get any of that when you work with people?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely culture of industry has an impact. It certainly does influence the culture of an organisation, but it doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. And we've seen, recently with COVID, people having to pick up sticks, overnight and go and work from home has been really, changed cultures for organisations around the world, where, previously they didn't think it was possible, and now of course it is, and that has changed
Yeah.
Do you find people play at expectations to some extent? So when I was talking about, Parliament and the hours and the drinking and whatever it is, all that, I think people go up there hearing that's what it's like, and then a lot of them at least sort of that's what they play to, and they sort of go and do that too. But it doesn't have to be like that necessarily.
So that's culture's sort of like you observe something, then you role model it,
Yeah.
and then you practice it.
Yeah.
And so if you're going into an environment where that's what you observe, then you're going to role model it.
Yeah.
So self-perpetuating.
As like social creatures.
Yeah, until somebody goes, actually no, they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And you just don't have one person stopping it because they become a scapegoat.
Yeah. You
have a number of people, which then causes a tipping point.
So does it take sort of big events like what we're seeing now play out in the media to sort of shine a light, expose that, and drive change? Is that how it has to happen, or can it?
No,
it doesn't have, not necessarily.
It's a bit slower. I mean, when you have a major event, can create a shift in culture quickly. But you could have just incremental change. And show people there's something that's not so drastic.
Yeah, I reckon the working from home, the COVID thing is kind of like it was what's the saying, necessity is the mother of invention, and it's like it actually just forced a massive change. And then in many organisations, it can actually be technology that is the tipping point. It's the thing that completely transforms everything.
Yeah.
Do you have like it might not be an official definition, but like when people talk about change and like change management, so like things are changing, and then there's transformations, which is a whole other thing. It sounds like transformations are it's just like a really big change, right? Is there a good way of describing what a transformation is? Is it just a really massive change to the way we do things?
Well, for me, that change management is the process by which you drive change. A transformation is actually what's happening to the business.
Yeah.
So it could be, it could be a restructure, it could be, introducing new technologies, it could be, a whole range of things. It could be selling businesses, buying businesses, changing your operating model. It's actually the change, whereas change management is the process.
So when people come to you, they're either already at a point of change or they've decided that they want to make a change. Like there's some agency there, I suppose.
Yeah. I think so. Sometimes you can talk through they kind of not performing at the level that they want, and they can see that there's an issue there. And I can work with them to find out what that issue is and what the solutions might be. But they are motivated to change something, even if it's the performance.
And they'll have like varying ideas about where they want to go, I suppose.
Do you ever walk into a workplace? It could even be past jobs. And do you feel as though you almost can get an immediate sense just by the environment, immediately what the culture's like?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's like certainly I've had experiences like where I've worked in the public service where I got a sense immediately walking through the door. Well, this is very different from what I'd imagined it to be. And then working in say private, again, very different again. I hear these stories all the time. Just walking through the door, you can almost smell the culture in the air just by the way. Maybe it's unconscious, the way people's body language.
Could be the level of noise in the office. It could be 100 things. And you're putting together like a forensic scientist, putting together the signals, and you can gain a lot.
I worked in a university. I remember walking down the corridor of my office for the first time. The first thing I noticed was everybody's door was closed. And then I noticed that, but it took me a while to sort of work out the significance of it. And actually part of it was even the way the building was designed. It was just like a long corridor. I know at ANU, like this building there where it's sort of an octagon shape, so people are actually sort of forced to walk around and interact with each other a little bit more than people with this other place to sort of retreat.
But on a job site, that when you walk onto a job site, you can immediately read the sort of safety culture that job has.
There was a guy I used to work with who said that you could tell from the car park how they park their vehicles on a construction site.
If they reverse back.
And if it looks messy. That's the other thing, housekeeping. Like a project manager who's really good at housekeeping. And people think, well, that's kind of the trivial stuff, but it's usually not. It's the attention to detail, and it tells you something about that they really care as well. I think I can remember working in a workplace where it really felt like that culture where if you had to go and speak to, say, like a more senior person, like a director, like you were going to the principal's office, it had that sort of feeling to it, where they were in the corner office behind their desk. People didn't go in very often, so when you had to go in, it was usually for something quite important. So it'd be like the kid rocking up to the principal's office because there's something bad. The other one I find interesting in workplaces is the arrangement of putting like personal assistants and having them kind of like almost like blocking, and even almost the design of how that operates.
And that's quite traditional, isn't it? Like the secretary used to have the desk out the front of the closed door.
But a lot of organisations have moved away.
Absolutely.
Where you've got principals or you've got, senior executives sitting on the floor and
what do you think about that? So I've heard pros and cons of it. I know one example, I told a CEO who moved his desk into sort of the main floor area. People hated it because they felt like, I don't know, observed or something, or they just didn't feel that they could get on with their work in the same way.
Yeah, and I think it's it depends on the personality of the leader.
That might be it.
But also, I think it can be quite tiring in an open plan environment, particularly if you're an introvert. I think just generally, it can be quite tiring.
Yeah.
So it's pros and cons.
I've been working sort of in an open plan office most of this week, and obviously I've been working from home a lot in the past, and I found working in the office really, really valuable for some things because emails and phone calls have just turned into like 10-second snippets of conversation sometimes as well. Check this with somebody and they're sitting over there so I can ask them. Move on, that's great, but then in terms of sitting down, completing a piece of work, writing a report or even an in-depth email or something is harder because I've got used to being at home and not having.
Well, then you've got that deficit for culture, and it's one of the challenges that organisations will have to deal with, is that you don't have that tacit learning, you don't have that observation about what the culture is. So, you can't walk into the office and feel what the culture is because you're on the Zoom. So you don't get that.
I'm interested to know what you think about that then with, let's say you're an organisation that has the option, especially now, to actually have whatever they want. So they can do a hybrid, they can do everyone back in the office, they can just leave it up to people to decide. What do you reckon is the solution there? Because almost every place I'm going to now, they're all grappling with it. They're all saying, what do we do? Do we actually require some people come back because we actually like having people there and the teams work better sometimes when they're together? And to your point, there's real benefits in just having the physical proximity to things. And then you can get a completely other extreme point of view, which I've heard from many others as well, who are just saying, I absolutely love it. I don't have to go into the office. I don't have to, this is ideal for me. I get much more work done. I get more productivity out of me. So you get these two extremes. And I think a lot of leaders right now, especially today in this sort of modern world we're in now, they're thinking, I think anyway, a bit more about what their employees want and need. And so they're kind of thinking, we don't want to make it a mandate for them to come back. So they kind of work out what's going to happen. And then at the same time, they're having to make a practical decision about, do we actually lease this building anymore? Because 20% of people here.
No, I mean, there's a million answers to that question. One is, what is the work? So when I say I'm more productive at home, as a leader, what's my role as a leader? If I'm just at home, am I just do I just dish out work and supervise the completion of that work? Or do I have a role in actually setting the tone of the company? There's issues around, can I direct people to come back or not? Because previously I had contracts that I was able to direct people. Now I'm not able to do that because we've got an overlay of government emergency arrangements where people are not required to work in the office because of COVID. So now there's a change in the balance of power between employee and employer. And so what is my situation now as an employer versus an employee? And can I actually entice them back? Do I want them back? What's my cost base? Is it, what's the trade-off between culture, innovation, that versus my office costs?
It's the perfect time for an organisational psychologist, isn't it?
It really is.
It is really interesting, right? Because there's just so many different factors, and not to mention that you, instead of thinking of it as purely, here's an office or a home or somewhere in between, others have looked at different models and said, well, why don't we have to have one central location? We can have like lots of little smaller places that people can go to.
Yeah, little hubs.
Yeah. So people are actually driving this. I mean, it is forcing some innovation. I think there's a whole heap of people who are sort of grasping and then that's it. We're going to take this.
Yeah.
But there's certainly others. I'm pretty sure. I mean, the public service, especially in Victoria right now, I don't think they're 75% back yet, are they?
Yeah. So I had a meeting the other day with Victoria Public Service. So like they looked like they were less than half in the office I went to. I'm not sure whether it's the word is.
Yeah, because that's a big one. Like if they return back to the city, but I know so many public servants who just love being at home and they don't want to actually go back again. At the same time, it is probably also driven largely by personality because I know some people absolutely cannot stand it, not for a second. And there's some other practical, interesting things as well. Like there's another person we're talking to who physically is finding it difficult because they don't have the nice office, the home office. They're doing all their work at the kitchen bench.
It's one of your safety obligations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is it a measure of engagement that people don't want to come back? And so, because there's a struggle, you could have 50% of people back in Victoria and, people getting, 10% of people back. Does that say something about your business? There's a whole lot of things that need to be thought through.
What's your preference? Would you rather be an office bound or?
I like a bit of both. Like, I don't know, it might sound like a cop-out answer, but I've been thinking if I had like sort of 2 days in office and maybe three at home, I'd probably like that. But it sort of depends on the projects at the time. Like for me, if I need to sit down and write a report and do that sort of more in-depth work, I just much prefer to be at home now because I find a few hours I sort of bash it out. There's no distractions. That's it. But if I'm in the office when I'm doing that sort of stuff, I'm chatting to everybody and every email that comes in, I'm stopping and responding to that. And that might say a bit about my own lack of discipline in the workplace. I don't know, but a bit of a balance would be nice for me. But I've got a nice room in my house that I use as my office, so I'm lucky to have that. What I found during that sort of enforced work home period is at the end of the day, I was closing the door to that office in a way I sort of wasn't before because I was trying to put that sort of psychological barrier almost between like the end of my working day and then just moving into my living room and having dinner and relaxing, that kind of thing.
So I thought that I would very much enjoy working from home because I always enjoy doing it when I do it. And I discovered about a month into it that I couldn't stand it. And I'm surprised. I was like almost like a little self-awareness that, I thought, because I thought I got the peace and quiet. I don't have people coming up to my desk all the time asking questions. Something about that is you kind of miss a little bit having the interactions, and sometimes what you think you don't like is actually good for you in a way, because it's getting the social connection. And I also think even for like the real true introverts, the ones who really would just like to lock themselves away, even then they might have a preference there, but it is pretty good for them to be social and to have the social connections as well, even if they've got a preference. What's your preference?
I think I like both, and that's not sitting on the fence. That's just actually I'm a bit of an extrovert. I'm a bit of an introvert naturally, but I also know that to get things done, for me, I need to be in front of people.
Yeah, I think
you need to be in front of people.
I need to have a relationship with them. I need to feel what's going on. I need to see how they're feeling. There's a whole lot of stuff that you don't get on a Zoom because it's very transactional, right? You're getting on with purpose, you start the meeting, you're not having those kind of intimate conversations about how you're going, how's your family, and you can see whether somebody's, got something else they want to talk about.
I sat down for an hour this week and had a coffee with the woman that she's kind of my opposite now. We were contacting another organisation and we're already working really well together. So phone stuff, but it was really good just to sit down and talk to her. And we talked about work, we talked about a bunch of other stuff too, and we probably wouldn't have done that on Zoom, or it just wouldn't have worked as well. So it felt good to do that because I haven't done that for a while.
And if you're new, how on earth do you really build up relationships.
Yeah.
If all you're doing is sitting on a Zoom meeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I have a client who's got a job recently in a reasonably senior position. So he's got a team and everything, and he can't stand it. He wants to have some face-to-face time. He really doesn't like it, and he went into this job thinking this is. He's expecting one thing, but of course, everyone was kind of thrown under the bus a little bit, and some worse than others. Some people didn't get it, didn't actually get to do their job, or they lost their job. But yeah, I've seen all of these different characters, like all these different responses to it, and it's fascinating, really, because we'll look back on it, no doubt, looking at it. Either it's going to transform everything, or at the very least, we'll look back and go, "Wow, remember that time we were doing all this Zoom stuff at home?" Do you think it's going to stick in the long term? Do you think this is going to be like something that we'll be doing a lot more of?
I think there'll just be a hybrid model. I think it depends on what you do as well. Who you are, what the organisation you're in. And there's some things that you just can't do from home.
That wasn't telling us to wrap up, but we are getting pretty close to wrapping up now. So what's on the agenda for you now? Like, have you got any upcoming plans? Anything of interest that you want to share? Go. Sorry. Every time we do a podcast, I throw up a question, and the person on the other end is like, "Oh gosh, that's really scary."
On the spot here, right?
Yeah, no, I've got lots of things.
Yes. Yeah. Oh no, this is one of those things where which one should I pick?
Nothing that I wish to share.
Okay, very good question.
Very wise.
Yeah, I think one of the podcasts we did was with Gemma, and I really threw a curly question there. Remember that one? We talked about system thinking. Yeah. And the system itself has an overall purpose, even though it's not aware of it, because it's a system. So like an organisational system or something larger. And I said to her, what's the overall purpose of the planet then? What does the planet do?
You're basically going to asking me of why.
Yeah, well, pretty much. Throw Gemma to the very seriously. She tried to grapple with it, and she was like, "Oh gosh, that's a great question." So I was thinking of some curly questions to throw up, like if you had to pick one leadership trait, probably the most important leadership trait as a leader, what would that be? And you can only pick one. You can't say there's lots of really important ones, and it depends on the context. You just have to pick one. What would it be? Is that a curly question?
It is.
Yes, good.
Good.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's always our forced choice. Always reveals always some good insight.
I think is it responsibility? Because if you don't, there's that saying in Truman, President Truman had the thing on his desk saying the buck stops here. Like if you have a leader at the end of the day who's not accountable / responsible, they won't sort of like be, which is the essence of what a leader is, right? Sort of like account for it, own it. Like nothing else is going to work really. It's not that that's the only thing by itself to make a good leader, but I think if that's not there.
No, but if you don't have that, I agree with that actually. And I think if you don't have that,
then answer the question. You're not supposed to answer the question.
But I guess it's elaborating on that.
But I was just thinking about my own team who, were very high performing in my last role, that they knew that, and it comes back to the question about bad news, right?
Yeah.
They knew no matter what they told me and how bad it was, I would take accountability and never throw them under the bus.
Yeah.
And that gave them the confidence to feel free that they could say what they wanted.
That's very good.
And that meant that, that we had a much more innovative, we had a much more open and trusting relationship.
Yeah. And you made that very clear, obviously.
Yeah, I would tell them.
Yeah.
And, we had lots of things that were challenging, and, that's one of my key core leadership values is take accountability and don't throw anybody under the bus.
Yeah, I've known a few leaders as well as I know people who tell me about certain leaders who actually come into the element when there is a problem as well. So they almost like enjoy it. Yeah. And my dad had a really close advisor, like almost a 2IC. And whenever there was a problem, like in a meeting or something like that, he'd immediately just go, "I'll deal with it," and just put up and he actually enjoyed doing it. So it was one of those things where
instructions full of that, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of
solving the
rescue.
problem.
Yeah, rescue people.
Yeah, but he actually enjoyed taking on difficult tasks. Like we've got a let's say a problem like a difficult customer or something, and everyone's like, oh gosh, they don't want to deal with it. And he'd actually go in and have the conversation because he wouldn't see it as an emotional thing. It would be kind of like, oh, this is a challenge, we'll just have to deal with it, we'll have to figure it out.
Yeah.
Whereas many people will avoid conflict and think there's no way we have to do that. Yeah. Well, as usual, we've sort of we have jumped around a few different topics, but they're good ones. And I think they all revolve probably around culture, which is your speciality. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us today. Okay, we're going to do the wrap up. All right.
You've got this book that you've been reading.
So we're returning to that immediately. Oh, you've been waiting.
Yeah.
Suspenses. Oh gosh. Absolutely. Well, it's going to be an anticlimax now, isn't it? All right. Yeah. So, all right. So we haven't done this in a long time, but what do we usually do at the end? We talk about something we're reading or something.
Yeah, reading, watching. I feel I usually carry the balance.
You do.
So I'm excited that you're bringing something to the table today.
Well, you also do what we're watching because I've watched a few different things actually.
Yeah.
And there's actually some good shows and some terrible ones we're watching. But we'll get to that in a minute.
All right.
So you're reading something as well. I'll let you go first.
Oh, okay. The last thing I read, it's not a profound book or anything, but my partner loves Stephen King, and he's always telling me to read Stephen King, and I read Stephen King, when I was growing up, and then I went and read Hearts in Atlantis, which is kind of like a collection of short stories and a novella all packed into one. And it's a really unusual book in a way because it does have a sci-fi sort of component to it, and it plugs into a much larger universe of Stephen King with these low men in yellow coats who are actually connected to the Dark Tower and all this sort of stuff. But you can also relate to it as I looked it up. One literary critic described it as like the best baby boomer novel ever written because
Hearts of Atlantis.
Yeah, Hearts in Atlantis, because it tells the story of kids who sort of growing up in the 50s, going to high school /university in the 60s, and obviously Vietnam, either participating in that war, protesting against it, whatever, and then sort of buying into that sort of materialism Reagan era in the 1980s and that sort of stuff, and just tracing all that, and it was really interesting.
You know the famous actor who starred in the movie version of that?
I know, Anthony Hopkins.
It doesn't sound like the movie at all, though.
No, I haven't seen the movie, so I need to go and do that. I've got the impression from the movie they just take one particular story, which is Long Man in Yellow Coat, which is the story of an old man and a young boy and their sort of friendship in this old man. This is really the sci-fi component. He's running from these alien monster kind of people, but it's not really presented to you like that in the book. They're just these bad men who wear yellow coats, and this little boy has to sort of give warnings and stuff. And that part of the book, it's done so beautifully, and I don't know, this innocence and bad stuff hasn't happened yet, and the world's really, really simple and black and white, and then suddenly they go to university and there's this war going on in another country, and some people are like, well, we're there, fighting for freedom, and other people are like, well, why are we there? We shouldn't be there. And then it's like, if you're not enrolled in university, you're going to get sent to this war. So there's people in the book they're on scholarships, and they realise that if they don't do their homework essentially, or they fall below a C average, they're gonna there's one scene where a girl says, if you don't pass your exams this fall, by next fall, you're gonna be in the jump sort of thing. So that's I found that quite interesting as well.
Motivate me, I think.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
All right. Do you agree with the sentiment that most Stephen King stories are really good premises, but the endings are always pretty bad?
I don't know. I don't disagree with it. I'm trying to look isolated on this particular one.
Yeah.
No, the ending was all right, actually. I don't want to spoil it because it's sort of, the ending took you back to the beginning in a nice sort of circle. And you kind of worked out that everything was okay in a strange way. So I was satisfied with this particular
Okay, good.
I won't read It. I'm scared of clowns, so I won't see.
You've seen the TV show, though, right?
I just admitted publicly I'm scared of clowns.
I think
no, I haven't
everyone
seen
finds
it.
clowns a bit creepy.
Yeah, no, some people love clowns.
Do they?
Yeah.
I've never met anyone who likes a clown. No, I mean kids like them sometimes.
I hate it.
They're creepy, they're weird. Yeah, it's kind of you sort of wonder, like the person who dresses up as the clown. It's just an odd sort of career choice, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What are they doing during the COVID lockdown? So what I'm reading, so I already told you Charlie Kaufman's
Yes.
Ant Kind.
Yes.
So Ant Kind. Ant Kind. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Rather than humankind.
Yes. So I stumbled across it because I was watching one of his movies, and then I listened to like a YouTube video, and he was talking about this book, and I thought, gosh, that sounds really interesting. And I won't spoil too much about it because I actually think it's something you'd really like it. It's very well written. It's very amusing. So the basic premise, and I'm only just started it, and it's very dense. It's like Christine was looking at the page open, and she said, "There's no paragraphs."
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I hate that.
I was only in a section for a particular reason.
I used to really tell students off, when I used to mark.
When they don't paragraphs.
Oh, they didn't.
Paragraphs. You got a paragraph.
Or put punctuation in a sentence, but that's a whole other.
Yeah, and use the full stop. For goodness
And
sakes.
a comma. I used to tell them that I actually faint from not being able to breathe because there's no commas. So.
Oh, yeah.
So is it a long book?
I always say to students, if you don't know how to use the semicolon, just use the full stop and just start the sentence. Don't play around with the semicolon. No, most people don't know how to use it. Yeah,
that's right.
I choose not to use it because I'm too scared to use the semicolon. So anyway, the book is about. It's very unusual, and I don't even think I've got to it, like what the real plot is.
No, you haven't at all. You told me that author and the title.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't know where it's going, but I'll tell you what happens at least at this point in the book. He's this sort of this quirky sort of character is the main character, and he stumbles across this really old man. He's like 110 thereabouts, and this man has spent his entire lifetime making this stop motion movie, and the excuse my computer, and I'm just going to turn, sorry to all the listeners here, but I'll tell you what will happen. That's Andres, who actually edits the videos, and he is notorious for writing a continuous stream of messages, and so that will be going off beeping for another 20 minutes. So he stumbled across this guy. He's made this film, a stop motion film, and it's such a long stop motion film. So stop motion, for those, I guess anyone listening, is where they basically you take like puppets or models and you just gradually move them, and you take photos of them constantly, and then it looks like they're moving. So a lot of the older movies used to use that sort of technique. But the movie's so long that it goes for 3 months. And so you have to watch it. You don't watch it in one continuous sitting, but you have breaks and you rest. But the whole idea is the movie is this experience that it invades your mind and your dreams. So I haven't got to what actually happens from that point.
That's not the
but then that's those pages that Christine was referring to, with like basically him detailing out what's happening in the movie. But anyway, the book is written really well. It's very witty, and the dialogue is exceptional.
So it's not the book that the movie Ants was based on.
No. Well, possibly. I haven't actually read the whole thing yet. That'd be interesting. Woody Allen did the voice of the main ants.
That's kind of random, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. It's actually fits in with the topic today.
And you write
That's right. Well, Charlie Kaufman's a Jewish writer as well, and he's that typical. He's very Woody Allen-ish, actually. If you've seen, and he gets very irritable. Like there was an interview he was doing. Someone asked him, they go, "Now you notoriously don't like doing interviews," and he absolutely gets furious, and he goes, "Why do people keep saying that?" He says, "I do interviews all the time, non-stop. I'm constantly doing media, and every question, the very first question people ask me is, you hate doing interviews. You never like doing interviews." He goes, "What are we doing right now? It's an interview." So he gets really, he's one of those people who he doesn't have any sort of filters in a way. He kind of speaks his mind. Very, very interesting guy. Now, before we wrap up, television shows very quickly,
Okay.
because we haven't done this in a long time. And I'm trying to remember the name of the show. You may have seen it. It's Christine and I watched it. I think it's called Behind Her Eyes. Have you seen that pop up on Netflix? It was
No.
trending as number one.
I think I have seen it on Netflix, but I haven't watched it, so I don't know what it is about.
Yeah. Well, I thought for the trap because I saw it was trending number one and everyone's talking about it. And I said, "Oh, I guess we should watch it." So we watched like three episodes, and Christine going, "It's a bit slow." It's a bit slow. It's interesting. It's getting somewhere. It's going somewhere. Anyway, it ends up going. It is absolutely the most absurd show I've ever seen. We get to this episode, and I was saying, "Oh my god, this is just absolutely ridiculous."
Okay.
But we're at that point where it was like 2 episodes left, so we have to keep watching to see what happens. Yeah, you have to.
That brings up an interesting thing. Like, would you ever walk out of a movie, not finish a book, not finish it? I do that. Like,
would you? It depends. I would. I walk out of. I'm
definitely
reading a book.
Definitely stop watching a show.
Yeah.
That's what it is. I have walked out of a movie rarely.
Yeah.
I've only done it when I was like by myself or something like that. Which normally I'll go see movies by myself when I'm waiting for like an international flight. This is the world it used to be, right? And I'm not trying to kill time, so I just like go to a movie. But
yes,
I walked out of Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, really?
Years ago. I should go back to it.
I enjoyed that. I like all the Stanley Kubrick stuff.
Yeah, usually I do. I just didn't like
Like it.
involving masks and
all that sort of
orgies
stuff.
and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, you got a fair way at Wayne, though.
Oh, yeah. What's that is?
Yeah. I've never walked out of a movie. I don't think I would. I think I'd probably just stay through.
I wanted to walk out of Speed 2. You remember that?
Yes, yeah.
That was bad.
Well, this is a philosophical thing. Have you sort of technically walked out of the movie if you never go to it? So is that just
What do you mean you never?
you mentally walked out of it before?
Oh, I've checked out of a lot of movies. Absolutely.
No, I mean like you don't go. You don't even consider going. Is that walking out?
Oh, you mean you never go to it?
Yeah.
Yes. So, maybe.
Yeah. You walked out of the idea of going.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, perhaps we should mentally walk out of this podcast.
Lovely note.
Yeah, very good. All right. We'll catch you next week. Or the week after whenever we do the next podcast.
Till next time.
Until next time.